Welcome to Office Hours. It's a pleasure to be here with Philip. I'm just back from China, nearly a 2-week trip, about 10, 11 days out in China. I have a little bit of a throat issue, only a minor one as a result, which is not too surprising given that I was in Beijing the day of the Beijing Marathon.
Did you run?
I did not run. I should have, maybe could have run in an earlier incarnation or earlier in my own life, except that the air quality index that day in Beijing was 436. The top of the scale was 500 of particulate matter index. Unhealthy starts at 75. And yet people ran the marathon who are stronger, but not necessarily wiser than I am. I want to thank you all for the terrific comments and suggestions that you've put in on our segment on culture and revolution. And before we get to those, I just want to mention a couple of things. First of all, this module, Culture and Revolution, is part of 4 broad thematic ones on the whole post-imperial period from the end of the Qing up to the present, looking at big themes. We will resume a chronological approach upon the ending of these. So the first one you'll remember is on foreign models and Chinese modernization. The second one is on the military persuasion. The third one on culture and revolution. And the next one on the engineering state and its origins from the 1920s up to the present. And a number of you had comments saying, whoa, we haven't really met Chairman Miao yet, and here he is already in culture and revolution. And the chronology is deliberately, in this sense, not the issue. The issue is the kind of broad themes that I would like you then to re-encounter as we go through the chronological history of modern China, having completed these broad thematic modules. But first, let me say something. We have some music on many of our modules, and say something about a recent one. You remember in the fall of Imperial China, we introduced it perhaps a little bit bizarrely with the overture from the Mikado, the wonderful Gilbert and Sullivan piece, Mikado, or The Town of Tiripu, its subtitle, a comic opera in 2 acts that is one of the most successful pieces of musical theater ever created. And it's shown there in part, or we highlighted it in part to emphasize that this was a moment that Western imagination began to shift toward Japonoiserie, toward really a fascination with Japan's development and modernization, in part at the expense of the Chinoiserie, which had dominated the Western imagination in the 19th century. And it is, of course, a period in which the great confrontation between China and Japan begins with the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895 and the shattering defeat of the Qing at the hands of the young Japanese Empire. You have also heard in the module on culture and revolution a bit of the Yellow River Concerto, a piano concerto arranged in a collaboration between musicians, a range of musicians, Yin Chengzong and Zhu Wanghua, based on the Yellow River Cantata done in the Yan'an period of Chinese communism by composer Shen Xinghai. It had a premiere, so based on something done and written in a matter of days in a cave in Yan'an in 1939, trying to celebrate musically Chinese resistance against the Japanese, premieres in a much more grandiose form in 1969 at the height of the Cultural Revolution, and became de rigueur during the Cultural Revolution, then banned immediately thereafter, but now played again in China today. Now, we have a whole range of questions. We've had a terrific set of comments, but also a bunch of questions, and let's start by talking about several of them, Philip.
Absolutely. I think you did very well to cover our sort of thematic focus in these modules, and I think that for many learners that will serve as a bit of guidance and a bit of an answer as we go forward. But we've had some wonderful questions dealing with not only the content of this module, but how this content fits into the scheme of Chinese history in the modern period. And so I'd say that our questions are grouped around maybe 2 to 3 different themes. One, is that a lot of you would like to know more about the details of what life was like in this period. So when we mentioned, for instance, that as a result of the May 4th movement, many new universities sprung up, people are interested in what the curricula of those universities were, what students were studying, and how they felt, how they responded to what they were studying. So, and the same issues came up in the Cultural Revolution as well. Another, speaking of this sort of idea about reaction and response, we had a number of learners take you up on some of your very interesting anecdotes about how Nixon was making comments to Mao when he saw the detachment of red women. And one in particular stood out. I'd love to know how Nixon responded to the detachment of red women. How widely were these operas disseminated? Were they available outside of China? Was the message meant purely for the Chinese people, or did the Communist Party use these art forms to communicate their intentions to a wider audience? And also, the ballet was clearly entertaining. Was this the only reason that Nixon enjoyed it, or did it signal something more to the United States?
It's difficult to know what President Nixon's musical tastes were, and so a biographer of Nixon would know better than me what he found amusing or not. He did seem, I think, as I said, not to quite understand that the heroes on the stage were impaling the soldiers, in some cases allied to that of the United States, then still ally, that is nationalist China. But it is difficult to see this form as having a much wider audience. It really was. It is an international art form, of course, adapted for Chinese political circumstances. And you could see it, and I did even in college at the time, one could see it played abroad, but not to any mass audiences, but only to those who had a very specific interest in China itself. And so its audience was a very large, and we must say a very captive audience in China.
I see. And so when it was played abroad, I mean, was it in the sort of art house context? Did people going there
not even
feel that they needed to
colleges and universities showing it in terms of a course on modern China or contemporary Chinese politics, things of this sort. There wasn't and isn't a big market for this in a market sense.
Okay. What about these days?
I don't see lots of people lining up to see a revival of Red Detachment of Women in, say, in the Harvard Square Theater, but you never know. Nor in China, although it is and can be seen again, and has a certain nostalgic aspect for those who lived through that period, remembering what they had to watch. Not necessarily positive nostalgia, but sometimes.
We had another, I mean, speaking of what people watched, what people felt as they watched, we had another great question on any underground movements in the arts during the Cultural Revolution in particular, or other revolutions in China.
There's a lot of underground art throughout the period of the 20th century and still is today, or art that does not have official approval. In the Cultural Revolution, and we'll see this more when we have a lecture by my colleague, Professor Roderick McFarker, when we focus specifically on the Cultural Revolution later on, very difficult to hide. Some art is held literally underground. I think Professor Bohl talked about a painting that was held as a portrait of a family patriarch or a set of patriarchs held underground, and a family that made a new copy of ancestral paintings in order to preserve the originals and hiding them under the boards of their house. But that is one way in which many people had to preserve either a family genealogy or certain pieces of art during this period of time. Many pieces of art were simply confiscated, and so this is a period, one of the many periods in the period of the People's Republic, in which those who were collectors or connoisseurs of Chinese art at a high level had their art basically confiscated. And the great museums of China today, such as the Shanghai Museum and so on, were filled as a result of these donations by people. And you'd be much wiser to donate earlier rather than later when given a request during the Cultural Revolution.
To transition a bit, this is not so much a question as a comment. We had a really wonderful email from a learner, And it was in response to one of our readings on art and literature, one of the speeches given by Mao Zedong, in which I'll just read some excerpts, in which the prolonged rule of the feudal bourgeoisie class to the detriment of the peasants and workers was discussed. And for learners who have been with us from the beginning, the thought arises that a legitimate grievance can be raised. I'll quote here, "For the 2,000 years prior to the 20th century, the gentry lived quite well. As I see it, the system was a largely static feudal society, interrupted periodically by wars, revolutions, and changes in dynasties. And in economic terms, it seemed, landowners garnered all the economic rent, leaving the people who actually worked the land at subsistence level, one drought or flood away from starvation." And so the question arises that given that we've presented a history of the gentry, a history of China in this way, do we agree, and to what extent do we agree or otherwise, that the gentry in China lived very well throughout Chinese history because the economic system was organized to ensure an ample supply of landless workers or tenant farmers, the result being a society with a wealthy gentry and a large number of subsistence level farmers?
So this is clearly the picture that is painted by Mao Zedong, and so it's an accurate, totally accurate reflection of Mao Zedong's view of Chinese society. And I don't think Professor Bohl would agree with the concept that Chinese society and gentry society had been static over the long durée of Chinese history, and I think he argues actually quite the opposite in all of his lectures. And there are, of course, one has to take this term gentry, which is meant to show the elite in the countryside. There are many gradations thereof. There are degree holders, which is a very tiny percentage. There are their families. There are those who are unsuccessful in gaining degrees, as we've seen in the scholars, and live a rather different life. By the early 20th century, the average landowner in China owns a few acres, that so-called landlord. Right. These are not large. This is not feudal in the sense that Marx would write about Europe under large latifundia, large estates, and legally permanent serfs. Land can be bought and sold. People can rise and fall in economic terms. There is a large social gap and an educational gap between those whom we would call gentry and those whom we would think of as commoners or farmers. But it is not the level of social economic disparity at all of what one sees in the Eastern European or Russian context at the same time. And there's a great deal more mobility. But one of the issues that we all need to think about, we have in China the application of Marxist terms from the European context, from the Soviet experience in particular, and from Marx and Engels' own work, to an economic and social context in China is actually quite different, and yet the terms used are the same. And so there's a large question to be asked, which I ask and will ask again later on in this course. Given the actual structure of Chinese society, was a social revolution what China most needed in the middle of the 20th century? But we will come back to that point, which is a very important point.
Wonderful. I'm curious also, though, if social mobility and a more sort of diverse set of roles was something that was in the more recent cultural and socioeconomic memory of people in China at the time. Why would a narrative like this, presented by Mao Zedong, be persuasive? What would give it its persuasive power?
Well, what gave Mao Zedong persuasive power at the end of the day was the strength of his military, and the fact. But what's very interesting about what this comment shows takes very seriously, and rightly so, Chairman Mao's speech on art and literature. It's really an essay, which at the Yan'an Forum of 1942, and it sets out the party's attitude toward art and literature that has remained on and off again, more or less standard doctrine until today. For example, Mr. Xi Jinping, on October 15th, if I'm not mistaken, of 2014, gave a speech at a symposium in Beijing talking about the proper role of art and literature in contemporary China. And he clearly alludes to Mao Zedong's Yan'an talks on literature and art of 1942, on the party-mindedness necessarily of art, on the need to have art that is for the broad masses, not for the elite, art that is not for the market, but for the public, art that is for socialism and not art for art's sake. There's not much, quite frankly, original in President Xi's speech, because Mao Zedong had articulated these issues from the party's point of view so clearly and so emphatically in 1942. The thing to watch, I suppose, now is that after the 1942 speech on literature and art at the Yan'an Forum, there was a purge of artists in Yan'an, and let us hope that after President Xi's speech there is not something similar. President Xi's speech does have a very optimistic element to it as well. He says fine artworks should be like sunshine from blue sky and breeze in the spring that will inspire minds, warm hearts, cultivate taste, and clean up undesirable work styles. Well, we should move on. We have a lot of interesting responses here.
Absolutely.
So we have a question, a discussion question, you remember. And for those reading the Red Lantern, the Red Detachment of Women, and that wonderful Nobel Prize-winning short story on Swallow and Dawn. After reading and watching and listening to various cultural outputs from the May 4th movement through the Cultural Revolution, what role do you think, here was our question, culture played in society during this period? How does culture relate to revolution? And we ask you to focus on a specific era, if you wish, or not. And so what are some of our responses here, Philip?
We had a truly diverse set of responses. So for instance, Diva Faustina mentions that if, when we speak about culture, we're speaking about cultural output in the form of the arts, then it was basically hijacked during the Cultural Revolution. What was produced during this time was not true art, as it was not an authentic expression of the artist's own feelings and emotions. And Diva Faustina goes on about how Mao's reply to Nixon indicated that the ballet was written by the masses, and a number of individual artists themselves have gone unrecognized during this period.
And that's certainly true. I think it's not easy to say it's certainly not my position in life to say what is art and what is true art and what is not. But this is art that has to fit into very narrow political confines. You can have extraordinary ballet, nevertheless, and magnificent dancing and magnificent artists performing in a highly constrained art form. Not the first or the last of highly constrained art forms, but the politics do determine a certain measure of artistic expression. But I wouldn't agree that it is that one could argue that there is no true art to be found here.
I see. So that when this comment goes on to say all artistic production was reduced to mere propaganda, and this propaganda was not genuine artistic expression because nor did it ultimately do its job of inculcating the masses.
Well, you know, there are many American wartime films during the Second World War that are fine films and excellent propaganda as well. So I don't, as remember our quote from Lu Xun, all art may be propaganda, but not all propaganda is art.
Great thing to remember.
Let's move on.
Absolutely. We had Paul H.C. mention that the Red Lantern and Ballerina in the Red Dress in both of the pieces that we presented seem to be symbolically the same thing, the impression of communism. Both stories have the idea of struggle against an aggressor that threatens the communist red utopian fantasy. And the commonality here is that the idea of iron will and a true belief in communism overcomes all obstacles.
Right, and it really takes the theme which we'll be talking about in the rise of Chinese communism that comes from the survival of this movement, nearly extinct at several times in its life, particularly its survival on the Long March, and Mao Zedong's personal belief that human will can overcome virtually any obstacle. What you also see in the Red Lantern, of course, is one of the more powerful examples of anti-foreign, in this case anti-Japanese art, as a means of showing, or at least depicting, the party's role in the anti-Japanese struggle. something that you can see virtually any day still today in China if you watch TV and watch films or soap operas that are based on an anti-Japanese wartime theme, because the legitimization of the Chinese Communist Party during the war was based in part on its claim to be fighting the Japanese, which of course it did in part. But we also need to remember, and this is where perhaps the communists are much more successful than the nationalists. No one looks at nationalist wartime propaganda anymore because they lost. And yet it was the nationalists who basically fought the war, because it was 90% of the soldiers who died fighting Japan died for the national government.
I see. I think this is maybe a good segue then into Bain USA Net's comment. Red, red, red. It seems we're inundated with the color red in everything.
Red is the color, of course, of international socialism. It's the color of the communist movement. It's the color of the new flag of the People's Republic after 1949. And so today there's much discussion in China about how can China avoid a color revolution.
I see.
That's because they know exactly what is, because they had one, a red revolution some time ago.
I see. Then we had a very interesting comment by Jonah32, which puts Hitler and Stalin on one side and Mao on the other, and reads, "When leaders such as Hitler or Stalin attempted to change the culture of their country, they began by claiming their ideology as quintessentially part of their national heritage. Hitler claimed that Nazism was fundamentally an Aryan ideology, and Stalin that Soviet socialism was a Russian one, whereas Mao was totally different in that respect."
Well, I think Jonah32 is onto something here in the following sense. Of course, Nazism is fundamentally both racial nationalism. Fascism has that element wherever it appeared in that era. And Stalinism, in some sense, as we'll talk about, has an international aspect, but in the 1930s, Stalin determined to build socialism in one country, not in many. Whereas Mao Zedong believed, arguably, you can read his works and they talk about the Chinese context, but they also have aspirationally at least, a universalist element to it. And it is his aspiration to be the leader of global communism in the 1950s and early 1960s that ultimately begins to destroy communism as an international movement. But there's readers onto something right here, that there is an universalistic element, at least in his mind, to Mao Zedong's work.
I see. Moving on, we have a quite interesting comment from Hegel. "I have studied communist art in the Soviet period, and I am not surprised to encounter yet another female crane operator on the side of communism using her work and party philosophy interchangeably."
Right, and he goes on to say, in the Soviet movie Premia, which is about a group of workers rejecting their bonuses because they believe the target was lowered too much, a female crane operator indicates that she desires a simple approach to life, like her crane, and the way it goes back and forth on its tracks. Who is to know? Maybe Swallow and Dawn, the story of Swallow and Dawn, is adapted quite liberally from a Soviet publication, but the influence of Soviet socialist realism on the art and literature of the early period of the People's Republic is very, very deep and very profound, and still is there in some measure. Again, if you listen to President Xi Jinping's recent speech, perhaps today. Well, friends, we've done a lot. You've done a lot. We will revisit these issues as we go chronologically through the history of the Republican and People's Republic period, following these set of 4 thematic lectures, of which culture and revolution is one. Thank you for truly engaging in the very complex issues of this module. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Professor.